Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Obviously, in 24 hours, we will turn the page on this long national nightmare that was Donald Trump. But unfortunately, Trumpism is not only with us, but will be with us long after Donald Trump exits the stage tomorrow. We are seeing an inaugural tomorrow that is unlike any we've ever seen in our lifetime, with a Capitol that was under siege and now has 25,000 National Guard patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. to keep our elected officials safe. No doubt this is a dark time for our country as we're celebrating the new arrival of hope for our country, sanity and decency in our democracy, and hopefully a healing in this country. But let's make no mistake about it, as I've said before, we cannot begin to heal as a country until there's accountability, not just to the actions of what happened on January 6th with the armed insurrection in an attempted coup to overthrow our government, but in all the months and years leading up to it in this country, where we had Donald Trump and Republicans fomenting hate and division, spreading misinformation and disinformation, and then after the election, and what we're here to talk about is the continued misinformation campaign around the election. We should be celebrating right now and preparing for a new Biden administration. Instead, less than 2 weeks ago, the United States Capitol was stormed by a violent insurrectionist mob bent on using force to halt the certification of a free and fair election. The District of Columbia and state capitals, including ours across the nation, now stand prepared to combat future acts of violence and domestic terror. We are in this dangerous position, make no mistake about it, because of Donald Trump's incitement of dangerous rhetoric, and of course, because for months the Republican Party has been lying to their base, as I mentioned before. From Donald Trump to Minnesota's Republican congressional delegation to state legislative leaders, the Republican Party has been telling their supporters that the 2020 election was stolen, when we know that's just not true. Paul Gazelka has spread misinformation on social media and basically about postal workers throwing out Trump ballots and about dead people voting. He even claimed that these false stories may have been enough to swing Georgia to Donald Trump. Representative Pete Stauber claims that he saw questions of validity in certain states and signed on to a lawsuit before the Supreme Court trying to overturn the results of the presidential election in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia. Representative Emmer signed on to that same Supreme Court case trying to undo the election results and spent well over a month refusing to acknowledge Joe Biden as the president-elect. Representative Hagedorn voted against certifying the results of the 2020 election. He also signed on to that same Supreme Court case trying to invalidate millions of votes and has attacked the validity of the election numerous times on social media. And immediately after the election, Representative Fischbach claimed that Democrats did not win the votes of the American people, and we're just finding votes at this point. She also voted against certifying the results of the 2020 elections. So even when Republicans do the bare minimum of acknowledging that Joe Biden will be the next president, they do it with caveat after caveat. For example, Tom Emmer's statement on certifying the 2020 Electoral College results does not say that Emmer certified those results because Joe Biden won. Instead, it says that Emmer did so because it simply is not the role of Congress to overturn those results. Those are two very different things. Emmer's statement also expresses sympathy for the millions of Americans who do not trust the results of this election. Enough lying, enough hedging, enough doublespeak. This is unacceptable. It is dangerous. It has to stop. And at this point, we're here today to demand that Republican leaders in Minnesota correct their false statements, and they state clearly, without hedging, that the 2020 elections were free and fair and that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States of America. This is vital for our nation as we move forward. This is vital for our democracy. This is vital for the ability for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who are elected to lead this nation and to heal this country, to move forward with legitimacy. Every attempt by Emmer and Stauber and Hagedorn and Fischbach and Gazelka and Republicans throughout this nation to undermine this election undermines our elected officials' ability to actually move an agenda forward. So at this point, you're going to hear from Representative Emma Greenman, and then after Emma, we'll turn it over to Melissa Franzen. As you'll hear from Representative Greenman, these claims are false according to virtually every credible election official, organization, and expert in the country. So with that, I'd like to introduce Representative Emma Greenman. Take it away, Emma.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm really glad everybody is here. It's a really important issue. As Ken said, my name is Emma Greenman. I serve in the Minnesota House, and I'm also a national voting rights lawyer, and have spent years on the front lines of the fight to protect the right to vote here in Minnesota and across the country. And from that vantage point, I can tell you that 2020 was and continues to be a stress test for our democracy. The 2020 election brought unprecedented challenges. Conducting an election in a global pandemic and with a president set on undermining the election and its results. It was a feat of strength, but we passed. Voters and state and local elections officials across the country rose to the occasion. We conducted one of the most secure and inclusive elections in American history. Here in Minnesota, over 30,000 of our friends, our neighbors, our family put their health at risk to serve as election judges and volunteers in service of our most fundamental right to vote. And voters turned out in record numbers, 3.3 million Minnesotans and over 159 million Americans of every race, generation, region, background, political persuasion showed up and turned out to make their voices heard. And yet our democracy continues to be tested by the lies and conspiracy theories intended to undermine the will of Minnesota and American voters and democracy itself. So it was pretty incredible to hear Minnesota Republican officials say last week, in response to the violent threats to our democracy, that what we need to do is listen to people who believe this and spread conspiracy theories and lies about a stolen election. We have, and those assertions don't have any credible evidence. They don't stand up to truth. So it's time for Republican leaders to do more than just tell us to listen. They need to stand up and actively disclaim the lies, disinformation, and conspiracy theories they've helped to amplify. It's time to affirm the truth that elections officials and agencies have been saying for months, that the 2020 election was free, fair, and secure. Here's just some facts. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Administration said that the 2020 elections were the most secure in American history. No hacking, no manipulation of any kind. And this is Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security. The FBI and then Attorney General William Barr, they were all looking, and they found no evidence of any coordinated effort to commit voter fraud. Top elections officials, Republicans and Democrats alike from 49 states were contacted by the New York Times and confirmed the 2020 elections were free and fair in their states. And Trump and his allies have brought lawsuit after lawsuit to challenge the process and the results. Of the 62 or more lawsuits they've brought, they've lost 61 of them by Democratic and Republican appointed judges alike. I could keep going and going, but this isn't about the facts. If it were, the conversation would have been over on November 7th when the presidential election was called, or November 24th when Minnesota certified our results, or December 14th when the Electoral College electors cast their votes. Our democracy worked. And yet we've seen the dangerous consequences of what happens when leaders irresponsibly amplify disinformation, doubt, and the voter fraud lie to undermine faith in our government. The 2020 election was the most scrutinized and picked over election in American history. No stone was left unturned. And what did we find? Incontrovertible evidence of a free and fair elections, of voters turning out to vote, of election officials doing their job, and of election judges, our friends and neighbor, showing up to do the work of our democracy. It's long past time Minnesotan Republican leaders admit this and stand up for our democracy rather than further undermine it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Greenman. Now I'd like to turn things over to Senator Melissa Franzen to talk about why it is vital for Republicans to acknowledge that these results if America is going to move forward. Senator?
Thank you, Ken. And like Ken said, my name is Melissa Franzen. I'm State Senator for Senate District 49. And right now, it feels like though our nation is holding its breath, like we're doing all we can to just get through these next few days peacefully. I'm sure you've all seen the reporting that the FBI had to screen those protecting the inauguration to ensure they do not have sympathy for people that assaulted our nation's capital on January 6th. This is the 10th frightening moment in our state's history, in our nation's history. It's essential that we make it through these next few days, but we also need to remember that President-elect Biden will be in office for at least 4 years. The threats of violence we are facing will almost certainly not end after Joe Biden is sworn in this week, tomorrow. That is because Republicans have not corrected the lie inspiring those threats. And I want to give you an example right here in Minnesota, where State Republican Majority Leader Gazelka said on Thursday, literally a day after the Capitol insurrection, and I quote, "It was a very close election, and there were more abnormalities that I've ever seen in an election," end quote. That is not helpful. In the wake of the assault on the United States Capitol, we saw a lot of Republicans call for unity, and I agree. We need to be able to move forward as a nation, but that will be impossible if Republicans insist on maintaining the fiction that our election was not free and fair. I invite the Minnesota Senate Republicans to pass my resolution, Senate Resolution 9, condemning the attacks on the Capitol and upholding the results of this election. How can Republicans call for unity while simultaneously implying that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president? How can Republicans denounce violence while fueling the conspiracy theories that are inspiring that violence? Calls for unity cannot simply be a political trick or duck accountability for one's party's dangerous and irresponsible rhetoric leading up to the assault on the Capitol. If Republicans are honest about wanting unity, we need their help to make that happen. That starts with Republican leaders here in Minnesota to clearly denounce the lies and the conspiracy theories surrounding the 2020 elections. They must clearly state that the elections were free and fair, that Joe Biden is president-elect and Kamala Harris is vice president-elect. Everyone else, from our courts to members of the media, to the numerous officials and government organizations Representative Greenman just mentioned, have tried to set the record straight over and over and over again. And it's clear that a sizable segment of American voters just do not believe them. It's time for Minnesota Republicans leaders to step up and tell the truth. If Republican officials cannot or will not level with their base and set the record straight, they will have sabotaged any chance at actually uniting as a nation. Our country, our state needs leaders, and we urge Republicans to step up to the plate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Franzen. Before we open it up for question, I just wanted to mention one last thing. Back in early December, after Representative Stauber cast doubt on the results of the 2020 elections, I wrote the following in a column for the Duluth News Tribune. I said that the sad truth is that when election results we do not like become election results we cannot accept, the likelihood of political violence increases. By refusing to stand up to President Trump and his cronies, Congressman Stauber is allowing his party to erode the legitimacy of the United States of America. And Congressman Stauber has and does bear responsibility for what that erosion unleashes. I warned Congressman Stauber at the time, but he did not listen. He did not act. And that has to change, not just for Pete Stauber, but for every Republican leader in our state. We have all heard the warnings from law enforcement. We have all received threats. I have received threats as a state party chair, and we cannot stand idly by and allow these threats to loom over President-elect Biden's administration and consume our political system. We are better than this. Republican leaders must speak out now, not just to denounce the violence, but to repudiate the lies that are fueling that violence. It is imperative that Minnesota Republicans level with their base and tell them the truth, that the 2020 elections were not stolen. stolen, that there was not widespread voter fraud, and that Joe Biden is the legitimate president-elect of the United States of America. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Brian to moderate the Q&A. Brian?
Absolutely. And so we've got a couple requests queued up. So first will be Bill Werner, then Mary LaHammer, then Theo Keith. If you'd like to ask a question, just drop a note in the chat. And all right, Bill Werner, you are unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it, Brian. Well, Mr. Chairman or Senator or Representative, this situation, the Republicans are dug in on this, and you know this as well as I. They have said repeatedly and from many quarters that they denounce the violence. They are not willing to acknowledge, I think many of them, that the results of the election are legitimate, or at least that there are not questions with the election. We are in a situation now, I think, regardless of what anyone says, that there are groups in this country that are going to try to make trouble, and they don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat, or whether Joe Biden or whether Donald Trump won the election. How does anyone at this point, whether it be Democrat or Republican, defuse this situation?
Well, let me start, and then I think, and Representative Greenman echoed this in her remarks. But look, you can't denounce the violence and what we saw at the Capitol and then continue to provide the ammunition, essentially, that led to the violence in the first place. It makes absolutely no sense. People stormed the Capitol because they believe that the election was stolen from them and that they were stopping the steal. And the more that Republican legislators and elected officials throughout this country continue this fallacy and continue to push this lie, the more violence we will continue to see. You can't condemn it and then essentially turn a blind eye to your own complicity in what's happening here. Every Republican leader who continues to spread this lie is complicit, and they have blood on their hands given the 6 deaths that we saw at the Capitol on January 6th.
Is there anything?
Emma or Melissa, do you want to say anything?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would just say, to speak to that, as a voting rights lawyer, I have seen the lies about voter fraud. They did not start in 2020. And turning a blind eye, particularly the Republicans and the right wing, using it as a really cynical ploy to change the rules, to restrict the vote, to get a result is anti-democratic, it's anti-American, and it is part of what got us here. And so I think that accountability is critical. Just saying, let's move on. We have all seen this is not going to end, and it's not just about President Biden, President-elect Biden until tomorrow, and Kamala Harris. It is going to be about local elections and state elections. These are not just Biden voters. These are all of our voters that we need to stand up for, and that we need to work to ensure that people have faith in our elections. And it is not by spreading lies that we do that. And so I think we have to be really at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, really aggressive in how we do that. And it can't start with some people say mentality when we know it's false and it's gotten us here.
And I just want to add a different light and context to it. We know that after the insurrection, many employers, many big businesses, we know from CEOs of Wall Street giants, including Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, BlackRock, condemned the riots. So did tech companies like Microsoft, PayPal, Apple, and others. They all said either sad and shameful was how they described it, or an assault on our nation. But what got us there? It was the lies. So I would say we have to have leadership, not just elected leadership, but a leadership across our country to denounce the lies. It's great that you denounce the violence. That's actually the easiest part. Mm-hmm. The hardest part is denounce the stem of it. Why did it happen? So it's going to take not just elected officials, it's going to take leadership across the country to step up to the plate and denounce this misinformation, because it's not good for our state, it's not good for business, it's not good for our country. So that's what I would add as well.
Let me just follow up, and then just one more quick follow up here. What can anyone say? What ought Republicans to say to these groups that are waiting in the wings I'm talking about. And I think, it's fairly well acknowledged that groups like the Boogaloo and Antifa and some other groups are waiting in the wings to climb on with maybe some Trump supporters who are objecting to the election, and to potentially turn this into a violent thing. At least
well, let me say
what happened in D.C. But Mr. Chairman, what can Republicans say to tell those folks to stop?
Well, I think the Republican Party has a choice to make, because there's two sides. You're either on the side of Nazis and white supremacists and far-right groups, or you're on the side of democracy and liberty and freedom and our Constitution. This is not a partisan issue. This is not about politics. There are sides here, and the Republican Party has to choose which side they're on. They're either on the side of our Constitution and our American values and who we should be as a country, or they're on the side of Nazis and white supremacists. It's as clear as the day. There's no other choice to make. So the choice Republican leaders have to make is, are they going to finally root out these extremists from their party? Secondly, I would say that the Republicans and any person in this country should acknowledge that if people have legitimate concerns about the election, that there are remedies for that, both through the courts, both through the state legislatures, both through canvassing boards. There are remedies to get to the bottom of whether or not, in fact, an election was free and fair. And I would say that every single one of those recourses were exhausted. Over 60 court cases, and every one of them ruled against Donald Trump and the Republicans. All the state canvassing boards, all the state legislatures, many of them controlled by Republicans who certified these elections. Some recounts, many recounts throughout the country, and no evidence of voter fraud found. So they've exhausted all the options afforded to them to bring these concerns to light. At this point, any continued claim of voter fraud or the fact that this election isn't free and fair is just an outright lie, and they know that. And that's the problem we have here, is that they continue to push this lie despite the fact that there's been multiple court cases and multiple recounts, and state canvassing boards who have looked into this. This is shameful. We'll move on to a question here. Mary was next, I believe.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, I would like to follow up on that discussion about recourse and remedy, and particularly to the state lawmakers. If I could start with Senator Franzen. It sounds like you have a resolution, and lots of folks are calling on Republicans to denounce this, but what actions can the lawmakers take in the state legislature in terms of ethics complaints, and also appealing to businesses? We have seen, nationally and locally, some businesses pull back from folks who have been a part of some of the election claims. Can you respond to that?
Sure, thank you, Mary. And my Senate resolution is on behalf of our caucus, because we do know that this country is so divided that we want unity. And it was drafted with a lot of input from our caucus. We brought it to the Republicans. They wanted to amend it. So they introduced their own resolution, striking literally the section that talks about free and fair elections and adding much more broader language. So they do not want to acknowledge it as a caucus. And that's pretty sad, because that is what we need to move forward. We're not just going to do unity for the sake of unity. A resolution has a strong voice when it comes from both parties in the only divided legislature in the country. So that's first step in terms of what we're looking to do in our Senate DFL caucus.
Yeah, and if I can follow up, you mentioned some of the businesses earlier who denounced the violence, but what about businesses who have pulled back their contributions? Is that something you're looking into, trying to put pressure on the business community?
I personally have not, but I do think that is a great step. And the second step is too, you've seen that a lot of the employees that were found to be part of those businesses are being fired. Why? Because people do not want folks that are going to be against the law and the rule of the law and that type of a branding for their businesses. This is, again, not something that we just want to do for the sake of feeling good and singing Kumbaya, but this is something that has long-standing repercussions for our economy. I do applaud that businesses have done that, and I look forward to seeing more. And if we have to do an open letter for that to happen, I think I look to our party to also support that.
Okay, quickly, Representative Greenman, in the House where Democrats control the chamber, is there any talk in your caucus about any ethics complaints or other actions against Republicans?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I will note that as a freshman, I know that Speaker Hortman has spoken to that, has spoken to looking at the all available options for the members who attended the Stop the Steal rally here in Minnesota, where some insidious language was used, and so I'd sort of refer you back to that. I think more generally, and I think to what Senator Franzen said, and what I think that Chair Martin mentioned earlier, is these should be nonpartisan issues. And so I think that the fact that we should be having this exact press conference with members of both parties, with leaders of both parties, in our state legislature, in our congressional delegation, and the fact that we aren't does not make this a partisan issue. It means that there's a problem. And so the other thing I would just say in terms of the legislature is we should be thinking about both how do we address this, but also how are we investing in and really focusing on Minnesota voters and the things that Minnesota voters are sending us to do, and strengthening people's confidence in our elections and in our and in the results. And that is not about flamming the flames of conspiracy and baseless disinformation. It really should be about looking at the ways that we can put Minnesotans back at the center of our democracy. And so little tolerance for more conversations about voter fraud and all of these things that we have seen get us to where we are, and really focusing on the things that Minnesotans put us in the legislature to do.
Brian, who was next, Brian?
Yeah, we have Theo Keith next.
Yeah, I guess my question's a little bit lighter, but Ken, are you guys planning to gather virtually or in person tomorrow for the inauguration? You got any events that you can tell us about?
Yeah, it's a lot of events going on throughout the day, of course, nationally, that the Presidential Inaugural Committee has publicized already. I'm sure you're aware of those. And then tomorrow evening, the DFL will be holding a celebration, a virtual celebration with many speakers and Minnesota electeds and luminaries and others to celebrate tomorrow, because as dark as these days are, certainly we are celebrating a new administration. And this is also a moment in the past that our country's always come together, whether you're Democrat or Republican, to acknowledge a new administration. This peaceful transfer of power, it means so much. And it's not just about tradition and fanfare. It's really about setting the tone for what we expect over the next 4 years. And so while some are going to continue to spread misinformation and try to undermine the legitimacy of this free and fair election, others around this country, rightfully so, are going to celebrate the inaugural of a new president and vice president for this country. And we're really excited. I'll have Brian send to you, Theo, a list of all the different events that are happening tomorrow, but we're really excited to be able to celebrate tomorrow, despite all the dark days and everything that we're seeing in the Capitol right now.
Okay, thanks. So nothing Minnesota based during the day, it'll be in the evening?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. And then I believe that was Carolyn from WCCO was next.
Hi, yes, this is Carolyn Cummings with WCCO. This is kind of circling back a little bit to Bill's initial question about what can be done to diffuse this. You know, if every Republican did denounce the rhetoric and the false claims about the election being stolen, that doesn't take away from the fact that you know, conspiracy theories live on the internet and they're spread widely, and sometimes corrections issued to errors, even on a report separate from the you know, election issue, you know, that might not reach those people, and people will still latch on to the lies. So I'm wondering, with that in mind, how can anyone really take any concrete action to dispel with any fiction about the election when you're talking about, you know, people who exist on the corners of the internet and will continue to perpetuate lies no matter who denounces them?
Let me start here, and you know, I think Melissa and Emma would have some great thoughts on this. But look, conspiracy theory is nothing new. People trading in misinformation and disinformation is as old as politics itself. This is not a new phenomenon. But what's really alarming to me, and I think to frankly anyone who believes in democracy, again, not through a partisan lens, but just pro-democracy individuals like myself, is that you now have elected officials who are latching on to what used to be the far extremes, right? And the real fringe elements in society. They're now latching onto this. And when you have elected officials at any level, frankly, giving credence to this, it not only amplifies it, it gives them the platform to make these really fringe ideas seem legitimate. And that's what's happening now, is the chorus of elected officials, the Republicans who've latched onto this conspiracy and continue to. For God's sake, we have 2 congressional members in the U.S. House of Representatives who are believers in the QAnon movement. That should tell you all you need to know with what's happening in our country right now and what is wrong. We have elected officials who actually believe in the conspiracy that's being traded. 2, I believe, and this is my own personal belief, I can't speak for our party on this, but we need to have more regulation as it relates to what is traded in information on the internet. We have regulation around TV advertising, regulation around print advertising. We believe in free speech, of course, but we don't believe that people should be able to incite violence and to trade in some of the darkest conspiracy in our country. And there has to be some real look at what's happening with social media and the internet and how we bring it in alignment with how we actually regulate other forms of political speech. So that's my personal opinion. Emma, Melissa?
Sure, I'll add on too. If you think about only 10 congressional members voted to impeach Donald Trump, that's very telling about the party issue in terms of political leadership and people, going along with sedition versus democracy. That's one side of it. I'm a lawyer by trade. Ken alluded to the amendment for free speech. That is paramount, that we want to make sure that we have free speech in this country. Basically, you can say anything you want in a corner, in any place, at the end of the street, anywhere you want. You are protected. Your speech is protected. People have come up to me and said they're not happy about Twitter or Facebook banning Donald Trump from the social media platforms. That's not government, that's private business, and they have rules too. So I applaud what they've done because it's been pretty peaceful since that's been done. Quite frankly, the anxiety level in my household has come down just because I don't have to read a tweet from someone inciting violence or questioning our democracy coming from the top. So that is paramount. I think there is room for regulation and legislation working with private business, working with Facebook and Twitter and other platforms. I rather see that at the federal level, frankly. So I think there's going to be room, and I think you'll see more activity, especially with the composition of the Congress, to see more regulation of what can be said and how to, not limit speech, but certainly regulate the violence on those platforms.
And I would just say, and I think that what we're talking about here is actually, and we need to name it as domestic terrorism and political violence. Like what we saw at the Capitol was not heated rhetoric. It was domestic terrorism and political violence. And we need the tools and I am not an expert, but I have been listening a lot to a lot of national experts in counterterrorism talk about some of the tools that we need to really think about it. And the deplatforming and the issues of amplification aren't just annoying. They're not just noise. They are actually part and parcel to how we got here. They're the last 4 years, and it's not just Donald Trump. It's the amplification, it's the acknowledgement, it's the winking and the nudging. And so that really matters. And the other thing I would say is, I hope you're asking these same questions to those Republican leaders, because we need to be in this together as elected leaders, as business leaders, as community leaders. And again, these are not partisan issues. The fact that only one party is standing up does not make it a partisan issue. And so I hope, as we think about all of the tools that we have, because we didn't get here overnight, and this is not gonna end this challenge on January 20th. I hope that we are actively engaging in these questions, not just of renunciation, but how are you and your party, how are you and your voters that are voting for you, that you are in relationship, how are you helping to de-radicalize? How are you helping to counter some of the same misinformation and disinformation that you spread? So I hope you're asking those questions, because some of those answers need to start and come from there.
Awesome.
Brian?
And then we have one final question from Ricardo Lopez with the Minnesota Reformer.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my question, I mean, it's of course related to the topic, but I'm curious, what are the free speech ramifications of political leaders or governments pursuing consequences, either through an ethics complaint in the legislature or pressuring businesses to withhold financial contributions, particularly when some folks have sincerely held beliefs about the election? I mean, short of defaming specific individuals or inciting violence, one could argue that the government has no role in policing the speech of individuals, both private and elected, who air their viewpoints with like-minded people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the tricky one because, you know, we cherish and value our First Amendment rights, but at what point do those, when those speech starts to incite hate and violence, and it becomes more than just rhetoric or a platform or ideas? At what point do we have a responsibility to keep Americans safe and to make sure that we don't see 6 people unnecessarily lose their lives like we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. You know, I think this is what everyone grapples with, but I think that the fact that Republicans are silent in this conversation, to Emma's point, I think really speaks volumes, because the reality is this is not, again, a partisan issue. This is an issue all of us as Americans should be very concerned about. How do we find that fine line between making sure that people have the right to petition their government, to have free speech, to make their opinions known without seeing the type of violence and domestic terrorism that we saw? I think this is a conversation that the Republicans should engage in, and they refuse to do that because they still are stuck in this idea that somehow the election was stolen from them. And so I don't have the answers here, but I know that we have to come together to address this in a real way.
And I would just say, as somebody, it's been a while since I am also a lawyer, but since First Amendment law. But I will say that I think that there's clear lines and vague lines, and we need to separate the two. Intimidation, harassment, violence, though that's not what the First Amendment is there to do. And so, yes, I think there's a whole conversation, and there's a conversation about social media, and there's a conversation about that we need to have in good faith about protecting people's, protecting the First Amendment and the right to speech, but also understanding that when it comes to acts of intimidation, violence, sedition, treason, those are not protected by the First Amendment, and there is a robust jurisprudence and smarter minds than me at the University of Minnesota and everywhere else who can really speak to that line. But this is not a moment where we're talking about the gray line. What we saw at the Capitol was not a gray line about First Amendment. We saw a police officer murdered. We saw the Capitol overrun for political purposes. And so I think that it's hard to have the conversation about the First Amendment, the nuances of the First Amendment, before we can even get to a clear line of we're all going to be on the side of democracy. We're all going to be on the side of keeping every American safe. And so I think that's the struggle is we can't have both of those conversations before we even draw the lines of where we are all for our American values and our constitutional values.
And I'll just add that the legislature dabbles in constitutionality all the time. So our bills, our laws get challenged in court, and that's the way the system works. It's worked well for centuries. So I believe there is a role for the legislature to pass laws in this environment, in this area, and whether those are too much, those will be tested in time through the courts. That's why we have a separation of powers, and that's the way the system works. And we are happy that the system works and has checks and balances, and that's what we're saying. There are checks and balances to your freedom. freedoms, to my freedom of speech, to my freedom to carry and bear arms. But there are limits, and those are partly have been adjudicated in our court system all the way to this U.S. Supreme Court. So we trust that system, and we are going to be abiding by it.
Great, thank you.
So, Brian, are there any other questions at this point?
There's one question from John Croman, and then I think we'll have to wrap there. It's just any thoughts on Mike Lindell? Has he disqualified himself in your eyes from running for governor?
You know, there's going to be a lot of time to talk about candidates who want to run for governor. I would say that I can't imagine after the decisive victory here by Joe Biden in November that anyone who's attached themselves to Donald Trump's hip is going to be a strong contender for governor here in Minnesota. But putting that aside for a second, the reality is I think that Mike Lindell's beliefs are really outside of the mainstream of where most Minnesotans and frankly most Americans are at. And but the fact that this guy who has all of these crazy ideas and ascribes to these nutty conspiracy theories can get an audience with the President of the United States really speaks volumes to where we're at in this country and to exactly why we're here holding this press conference, right? You know, the 14th Amendment was put in place after the Civil War for a number of reasons, but partly to make sure that people understood that when you take an oath as an elected official in this country, you are not taking an oath to a political party. You're not taking an oath to a political leader or fealty or loyalty to the President of the United States. If you read the Constitution, it's very clear. And you read that amendment, you are taking an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and our country, not your party, not a political leader. And what we continue to see, and their absence and their silence right now at this critical moment by Republican leaders is not only shows that they're complicit in this, they still refuse to take the oath that they took just a few days ago, many of them, seriously. It's time for Republicans to stand up and protect our democracy, not their party, not their own political ambition. And people like Mike Lindell and Paul Gazelka and the whole lot of them, each time they continue to spread misinformation and undermine the legitimacy of this election, they show that they are putting their oath to their party and to Donald Trump ahead of the American people.
Awesome. I think that does it. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Emma. I know how busy you are, so thanks for jumping on. Yep. All right, take care.